Think about the worst punishment a court could hand you today. Prison. Years of your life, locked in a concrete box, cut off from everything you know. It sounds like the harshest thing a society can do to a person. But your ancestors invented a punishment that made prison look like a vacation. It didn't require walls. It didn't require guards. It didn't require a single drop of blood. It just required everyone around you to act like you didn't exist. And it was more effective than anything the modern justice system has ever produced. To understand why, you have to understand what your ancestors' world actually felt like. Not the world of cities and nations and legal systems. The world of a band of 20 to 50 people, moving together across open land, dependent on each other for every single thing that kept them alive. Food came from cooperation. Shelter came from cooperation. Protection from predators came from cooperation. A child who lost the support of the group didn't survive. An adult who lost it didn't survive much longer. The group was not a social preference. It was the entire infrastructure of existence. And everyone in it understood this with a clarity that no modern human has ever had to feel. This is the world in which ostracism was invented. Not as a formal policy. Not as a deliberate legal mechanism. As a spontaneous, instinctive, collective response to behavior that threatened the group's survival. Someone stole from the communal food supply. Someone violated a sexual boundary. Someone repeatedly acted in ways that endangered the people around them. And the group's response, without discussion, without a trial, without a designated authority figure making a decision, was simply to stop. Stop acknowledging. Stop responding. Stop including. Stop seeing. Here is what nobody tells you about what that actually felt like. Modern neuroscience has spent the last 2 decades studying social exclusion in laboratory conditions. What they found should permanently change the way you think about human pain. When researchers at UCLA placed participants in a simple computer game where other players gradually stopped including them, the brain scan showed activation in a region called the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex. This is the same region that processes physical pain. Not similar to it. Not analogous to it. Identical activation, identical intensity, identical neural signature as the experience of being physically hurt. Your brain does not distinguish between being hit and being ignored. To the brain, social exclusion and physical injury are the same category of experience. Let that sink in. Now imagine that experience not in a laboratory for 20 minutes. Not in a school corridor for a day. But sustained. Continuous. Applied by every single person you have ever known, in every waking moment, with no end date and no appeal process. You speak. No one responds. You gesture. No one reacts. You cry. No one looks. You sit beside someone at the fire and they move without acknowledging that you moved them. For days. For weeks. Until either your behavior changes completely and the group decides to readmit you. Or it doesn't. And you face the open land alone. The Jute-Hontsi Bushmen of the Kalahari call it the death of the social self. Anthropologists studying the practice across cultures note that the psychological deterioration it produces follows a consistent, documented pattern. First comes anxiety. Then comes desperate, escalating attempts to re-engage, performing exaggerated helpfulness, offering excessive gifts, attempting humor, attempting conflict, attempting anything that produces a reaction. Then comes withdrawal. Then comes what clinical psychologists would recognize as acute depression. And then, in cases where the ostracism was sustained and total, comes a complete dissolution of the sense of self. Because the self, for a social animal that evolved in a group, is not a private internal possession. It is constructed and maintained by the reflected responses of the people around you. Remove those responses entirely and the self begins to collapse. This is not metaphor. This is neurology. And your ancestors knew it. Not in clinical terms. Not in the language of dorsal anterior cingulate cortexes and neural activation patterns. But in the deep, accumulated, generationally transmitted knowledge of what worked. Ostracism worked. It worked faster than violence. It worked more reliably than exile. It left no wounds that required healing. It required no designated executioner, no formal authority, no infrastructure of any kind. It required only the collective agreement, usually unspoken, of the people who shared your fire. But here is where the story gets genuinely complicated. Because ostracism was not only used as punishment for genuine violations. Anthropologists documenting its use across multiple hunter-gatherer cultures have noted a darker pattern. It was also deployed, sometimes, against those who were simply different. The person whose behavior was unusual rather than harmful. The person who heard things others didn't hear or saw things others didn't see. The person who refused to conform to the group's expectations in ways that made others uncomfortable without actually threatening anyone. In those cases, ostracism was not justice. It was control. And the line between the two has always been thinner than the people applying it were willing to admit. Here is what the modern world got right. The legal system, for all its failures and its staggering recidivism rates, does attempt to draw that line. To distinguish between harm and difference. To require evidence before punishment. To provide some mechanism of appeal. It does this badly. Expensively. Inconsistently. But the attempt itself represents something your ancestors' system did not have. A wall between punishment and persecution. And that wall, however imperfect, is not nothing. Here is what the modern world got catastrophically wrong. It replaced a punishment that targeted the one thing the human brain cannot endure, social invisibility, with a punishment that targets the one thing the human body can endure almost indefinitely with the right support system. Physical confinement. And then it expressed bewilderment when it stopped working. The 70% recidivism rate of modern prison systems is not a failure of resources or policy or political will. It is a failure of biology. You cannot rehabilitate a social animal by isolating it from society and calling that the punishment. You cannot threaten a brain wired for group survival with the removal of a group it was never meaningfully part of. The ancient punishment worked because it threatened the one thing every human brain treats as equivalent to death. The modern punishment fails because it threatens something the human brain, at its deepest level, was built to survive. Go back to that concrete box. The person inside it has food, has shelter, has warmth, has a community of other prisoners, a social structure, a hierarchy, a set of relationships. By your ancestors' measure, the worst punishment the modern world can deliver is more comfortable than a bad week on the open steppe. The thing your ancestors understood, and modern justice systems still have not fully grasped, is that the human body is almost indestructible. But the human need to be seen, to be acknowledged, to exist in the reflected awareness of other people, that is the most fragile thing your species has ever produced. And it has always been the most powerful lever available. You feel this every time a message goes unanswered. Every time you speak in a room and no one responds. Every time you walk into a group and feel the specific, particular horror of being looked through rather than looked at. That feeling is not social anxiety. It is not sensitivity. It is 300,000 years of survival wiring telling you, in the only language your deepest biology speaks, that what is happening to you right now is dangerous. That it has always been dangerous. That the group is everything. And that being outside it is a version of death your ancestors understood long before they had words for either. Like this video if it changed the way you think about something you feel every single day. Subscribe to Ancient Drawn for more stories like this, because your ancestors understood things about human nature that we are only beginning to rediscover. And leave a comment telling me, have you ever experienced being invisible to someone?